Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. So I'll let Ben introduce himself. I believe you're getting your PhD at McGill.
Yeah. So I'm a doctoral candidate at McGill, so in Montreal. I'm a political theorist by training. My background is in history, intellectual history, and the history of political thought. And my work these days focuses more on a mix of kind of constitutional theory and political theory. And I also do a fair bit of stuff now on Canadian political thought as well.
Yeah, you've got quite the Twitter following, primarily of conservative viewers, but also liberal, and the media is obviously beginning to recognize kind of the profundity of the thoughts that you're putting out there. So why don't we start with, what do you love about this country? What do you love about Canada?
Well, I think it's a great way to start. Some people know this, some people don't, but I'm a naturalized Canadian citizen. So I was born in the UK, and I grew up in the UK, and I moved here when I was 15. I was just starting high school, and it's funny. I had a rather miserable high school experience here, and it was because it was kind of a culture shock when I moved here. There's just something about moving countries when you're 15 years old it's not easy, and I had trouble settling in when I moved here. But in hindsight, I've actually come to think that it was a blessing in disguise for that to happen to me, because it kind of made me much more something of this is now my adopted home, but I had this kind of outsider perspective for a while, and I think it made me much more observant of things that if I was kind of completely submerged in kind of Canadian life and Canadian culture, I wouldn't have noticed.
There's a level of objectivity that you have that I think a lot of other people kind of are blinded perhaps by biases that are just inherent, right?
Yeah, it sounds pretentious to say it and presumptuous, but I think it is a kind of like I say, a blessing in disguise, where when you're, I feel very Canadian. I think I am very Canadian. I mean, I get different things from different people about how I sound, whether my voice sounds like a Canadian or a Brit, but it definitely gives you a unique perspective of just being able to see things that you probably wouldn't notice otherwise. I'm trying to think. I can't think of any specific example off the top of my head.
Well, let's go down that path though of you've observed this. Your high school experience perhaps was more challenging than you would have liked, but you have decided to adopt this as your home. You haven't gone back to the UK. What is it about Canada that makes you want to stay? Obviously, besides your fiance, but what is it here that you love, and you've become such a commentator on the Canadian experience, and particularly I love your thoughts on how our media is obsessed with America, and that's not helpful. But what is it that you like about this place or love?
Well, I think honestly, Canada is just it's a good place. There really is. Canada's history is kind of it's remarkable in that we built this beautiful, ginormous. Still relatively small population, but this ginormous country, it's peaceful, it's prosperous. It's accommodating of two nations, even more than that. And we are, as much as Canadians think of their history as boring, the achievement of what we built here in the last 2 centuries or so is actually one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, I think. And it's something that I don't think we should be proud of. And I don't think we recognize kind of how special what we built is, and so I think what I've come to love about Canada is just that it's a place where I feel it's not just about kind of personally feeling welcome or feeling at home. It's a place where you can pursue things. It's a place where you can have ambitions. And it's a place where you can fundamentally build. The point of life isn't just to be free or anything like that. The point of life is to try and build a good life. And there's few places in the world, even today, where you have better opportunities to do that kind of thing. And it's because of something it's not just a kind of a happenstance where just we're just a developed Western nation. There's something unique about the Canadian spirit that makes us able to build a society like that.
I'd like to dig into that. What do you think it is about? I mean, one of the things I've noticed in my travels to the UK and even to the United States a bit is that we do see a more entrenched class system there, where people are kind of born into a certain way of being and live that out almost as if it's a predestined outcome. Whereas here, I mean, myself as an example, I come from a town of where there's 12 houses in the ghost town, quote unquote, that I grew up in. And yet by the age of 23, I was, in the prime minister's office. That's the Canadian story in a way that I don't think a lot of other countries have anymore. You're from the UK. I noticed a lot of class-based stuff there.
Yeah.
What about the Canadian experience do you think is kind of, I don't know, guarded us against this class system that has caused so much, I would say, um, stagnation in a lot of places.
Yeah, no, very, very good observation. It's definitely something my background is is quite working class. My parents both I was born in a place called Stockport, which is in it pains me to say, but it's in Manchester. Basically, it's not Manchester. I'm not from Manchester. It's in that area, and it's a very, very kind of post-industrial. Manchester is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, yes.
So it's a place that's just rife with those kind of class dynamics and class divides. And it's fun. It's my upbringing in the UK was like I said, my parents are very working class. We're a very working class background, but they kind of grew into a kind of a generic kind of middle class background. I grew up in a kind of generic middle class house. But it's funny how even with one thing I don't think people understand. I think this is true. I don't think Canada is a classless society by any means, but one thing that I don't think people understand enough is that class really is not just about income. It's not just about
No.
it really is a kind of identity is not even the right word, but it's a divide where there is no escaping it in some sense. And one of the things because when I was growing up in the UK, you just kind of you absorb these things without noticing, and it's one of those things that when I moved here. I never had to deal with the kind of. I've never been looked down on in any way here.
Does it feel like a breath of fresh air? Does it feel like freedom? Like, describe how that changed your mentality, maybe towards your own life.
It made me. It made me. It's interesting, actually. In a way, it kind of. It made me reaffirm my class back, my origins, my kind of working class origins, in the sense that here you're not kind of you're not bound by them. You're not tied up to it forever. So you can kind of embrace. There's no need to try and hide or to try and pretend you're something you're not here. In the sense that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that I'm from the UK. It doesn't matter that I'm working class. It doesn't matter this or that. I see the opportunities. I suspect that I'm the first person in my family to go to university.
Yes, yes.
And I suspect that had we stayed in the UK, my family stayed in the UK, I suspect I probably would have still gone to university, but I highly doubt I would have had. I wouldn't be doing a PhD. I wouldn't be looking into that kind of life afterwards. So I suspect that is one of those things where. There's I don't know if freedom might not even be the right word for it, but the opportunities I have here just wouldn't exist in the UK. And it's definitely there's lots of reasons for that, but kind of the lack of and again, it's not to say that Canada doesn't have class. Class is still important here, but it works in a different way where it's not bound up into kind of 7 centuries of history.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's part of being such a young country, right? Is we haven't really defined. I've had it said to me before by people that the only reason we don't have classes yet is we haven't been around long enough. But I'm not sure I agree with that. I think the Canadian identity is something that we can craft as Canadians, and I don't think we need to allow that kind of predeterminism to
No.
seep into our national consciousness.
No, the nature of one of the kind of there's a theme in a lot of my writings on this. It's that Canada's always been, it was founded as a country built on 2 nations, right? English and French Canada. but Canada's becoming, as it changes and as it evolves, we're becoming a country of not just two nations, but two plus nations, of multiple nations instead of just two. And I think one of the the distinct advantages of that is that there's never going to be the kind of the divides in Canadian society and Canadian life, I think, are much more regional and cultural and linguistic. And while that has the downsides to that, it forces us to build a much more pluralistic society, which means that those kind of class dynamics just get. Again, it's not that we don't have a kind of an elite class here at all. I'm not saying that at all. It's that the kind of the common consciousness we have doesn't have to just build around the kind of the pluralistic nature of what we're trying to build around forces us to kind of class becomes one of many considerations, which in the process makes it kind of
less important.
Yeah, thinner, which has there's downsides to that too. But
no, absolutely no.
Yeah.
One of the things, so you mentioned nationalism and a country of many nations, and I really like some of your thoughts on that. I'd like to hear more, or I'm sure the listeners would like to hear more about your thoughts on how patriotism is possible in I mean, because we've got a prime minister right now who doesn't really believe in patriotism to some degree. I don't want to mischaracterize his position, but he essentially has said that Canada could be the first post-national state.
Yeah.
And I completely disagree with him on that, and I think you do as well. But I think the idea of nationalism in a country made up of many nations, like how do you square that circle?
Well, I'm very I don't hide this. I'm very I don't agree with I'm very influenced by George Grant on some of these things. I don't agree with Grant on a lot of things, but I think on this one of his kind of central foundational kind of the ways he frames his arguments is that he believes in this, that nations ultimately have to have some sort of intent, some sort of purpose that binds them together. And a country like Canada that is made up of different nations and different groups of people is going to need a kind of explicit intent even more, given that kind of internal diversity. And the kind of the way I would about the kind of short sweep of how I would characterize the way that the last kind of 100 years or so of Canadian history have gone is that we had an inevitable kind of so there's a certain kind of I don't know what I'm trying to think of a polite word for a kind of larpiness where people kind of like to nostalgize an old Canada, right? The British Canada, the 19th century Canada, the old Dominion. And I'm all for kind of celebrating that history.
Or even Pearson's Canada, right? The peacekeepers. Yeah. That too is a kind of nostalgia.
Yeah, and the kind of that old Canada was replaced by this new kind of liberal nationalism in the kind of the second half of the 20th century. The problem with the kind of liberal nationalism that we've ended up kind of building is beyond it being not even so much it's artificial, because that doesn't mean it's that doesn't make it wrong or kind of illegitimate. The problem with it is it's unable to command the kinds of thick loyalties and attachments, and also the intent that would actually kind of bind us together. One of the kind of it's a pet peeve of mine. This is a thing that it's something you'll see from Canadian conservatives more than anyone else. Is they'll just kind of dismissively say that Canadian nationalism and identity is just about not being American, as if that kind of discredits it. Well, the very nature of the fact that we are. There's nothing invalid or illegitimate about the fact that we want to define ourselves as not American.
Right,
doesn't mean that
right.
Hollow. There needs to be something kind of substantive built onto why we're not American. But all sorts of kind of the wellspring of all sorts of national movements is in kind of opposition to something, right? Like the Irish nationalism, Polish nationalism. Just pick all sorts of countries where the kind of the origins of their national movement is recognizing that they don't want to be like their neighbor. It doesn't mean that they hate their neighbor or anything like that. It just means that they want to be distinct and different. And the question for us has to be, if we're going to maintain that distinctiveness, there has to be something cohesive that actually glues us together. And just saying the liberal nationalism that Pearson and Trudeau Senior and then Justin Trudeau himself is kind of. I think I give him the one thing I'll give him credit on is I think he actually does. I don't think he's being entirely vacuous when he says that we're post-national. What I think he's actually kind of grasped is the dead end of
right, and that's where we are. But just because we're at a dead end doesn't mean that we should just stay there.
Yeah, exactly. And if we're my one of the kind of things I think that is, I'm not the only person to say it, but it's something I kind of emphasize a lot, is that the kind of the growth of this liberal nationalism, at the national level. What it's done is it's built space for these kind of these local, not just provincial, but local, subnational, territorial, all sorts of kind of local distinctive identities. Those are the loyalties now that actually command the kind. Those are the identities now that command the kinds of loyalty that you can actually build kind of cohesive political communities around. And what we've the challenge for kind of for the 21st century challenge for Canada is figuring out how to glue these growing different, distinct, identities together in a way where we've still got some sort of purpose that glues us together and allows us to remain a kind of sovereign, distinct nation. But it's one that is built on kind of, these local loyalties, are not just trying to kind of either manufacture this kind of fake liberal nationalism that doesn't command loyalties, or trying to go back to a kind of old, in English, kind of British nationalism that just isn't. It's there is no going back to that. There's ways that history should be celebrated and kind of carried on. And I've written about how I think there are ways that you can kind of continue this in a kind of distinctive way without rejecting carte blanche our kind of our heritage. But there's no going back to the red ensign. There's no going back to stuff like that. And we shouldn't want to go back to that either. The trick is going to be finding, the only way out is through, as they say. So the only way.
The obstacle becomes the way, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
I find it interesting that you say that we can't go back to the British way. I agree with you. I think so much of what we've done as Canadians, as we've been searching for this sense of identity, I kind of see Canada as like a teenager moving into adulthood. Maybe we're in university, but we still live with our parents, kind of thing. And it's time to move out and become our own country. And what does that mean to us is the question that I think Canadians are asking, just as any teenager or young adult would be going through. Like, who am I? Finding their own identity. A lot of people make this out as if it's a bad thing, as if, the fact that we don't have one somehow says something negative about us. But I think on a geological time scale here, or let's call it a human time scale, we're still a very young country.
Yeah.
And I don't think it says anything bad about us that we haven't quite figured out our place in the world yet. Just like someone growing up, they
Mhm.
start under their parents' tutelage, then they kind of go into their own, their friends become more important to them, and their careers become important. So what do you kind of like, so part of what we're trying to do here at A Better Story is, what does the future look like too, right? Like, what are things to be excited about that Canada can get involved in that will help us come into our own? We just recently had a guest on talking about the space industry
Mhm.
and that the opportunity that represents for Canada. Later on today, we'll be having a guest who's going to be talking about hydrogen and the green economy, which, as much as the Liberals have tried to grab hold of that and take that as their mantle, there is a lot of potential there. What do you
Yeah.
see as some of, like, what can Canada become? What are some of, because when you talk about these regional identities that have consumed us, and let's say I'm an Albertan, I'd say I'm on the front lines of that right now,
Mhm.
of this idea that Canada doesn't work anymore, and that my loyalties are to my regional identity more than they are to my national, or let's say state identity. How do we craft a vision of the future that makes people excited? I mean, because all of these things are constructed, and I want to just go back to an earlier point you made where you said, um, you know, Canada has built something impressive here. That's what you love about it, is that we've built a place where there's opportunity. We've built a place of relative peace and order. It's always easier to destroy something, to tear down, to
Mhm.
revolt than it is to build. And that's why deconstructive philosophy, I think, has taken over to a large degree, because it's just an easier thing to do to break something than to build it. But we as Canadians have a long history of building as opposed to tearing down.
Mhm.
So maybe we need to reimagine ourselves as constructing something. But when you're building something, you need a blueprint. So I'd like to hear from you. what is kind of a blueprint, or maybe just the imagination of a blueprint that you have for what it is possible for us to be going forward?
Well, I think there's what one parts of what I'm saying is very is in some sense quite theoretical. But I would tie up that kind of the emergence of kind of the not just a bi-nation but a multi-nation kind of. I would actually just tie it up with kind of concrete. If you look at kind of long-term thinking about long-term trends, some like Western Canada, places like Alberta, these are young and growing parts of Canada. So I think if you were to take a kind of a God's eye view of Canada, and you were looking kind of over the next 50 or 60 years, or even next century or so, one of the long-term trends that is happening, and it's part of the kind of some of the kind of the tectonic shifts in the plates hitting one another are connected to this. Is that the Canada's center of gravity is shifting westward, right? The demographically growing parts of the country are in the west, and the country is eventually going to have to adapt to reflect that. So some of that is just kind of minor structural things. So it's literally just like Alberta having more seats in Parliament, little things like that. But I don't. I am very sympathetic to. I don't go I'm not sympathetic with any kind of like hard separatism anywhere in this country because I want it to stay together.
Yes,
but
yes.
I'm very sympathetic to grievances in the West that kind of the country we exist in right now reflects a kind of political order that doesn't reflect the realities on the ground right now and also where we're going. So what that would look like, you can think about. I'm very sympathetic to. Just one kind of specific example, even though it's going to be incredibly difficult to actually get it done constitutionally. The idea of having a Senate that actually is built, that is reoriented into something that tries to actively kind of become a regional representation body, where I don't know. I've kind of I've thrown ideas against the wall with some people. I've often wondered whether maybe kind of a reform you could do with the Senate would be something like. Having a kind of a norm established where there's no formal rules change, but a norm established where provinces and premiers got to actually kind of choose their, how like Alberta has
elected, yeah.
So maybe let every province decide for itself how it wants to. So obviously the way that the seats are divvied up in the Senate is regional; it's not just provincial, but something like. But something like that. But my broader kind of concern is that I do think the grievances in the West, especially about how Canada does not. I don't see it as kind of a nefarious conspiracy the way that it sometimes gets portrayed. I think it's just that Canada has become its political structures are in some sense quite sclerotic and quite archaic and need to be kind of modified and updated to reflect these kind of changing dynamics. So what does Canada look like if there's kind of three central political axes? If you have kind of, Ontario, the central Canadian axis, the French Canada, French Canadian, Quebec axis, and then a kind of Western Canadian axis, plus all of the other smaller things that are going on. What does a Canada of those kind of three poles, as opposed to two, have to look like? And I think it's going to require structural change. It's also going to require. I think there's going to have to be a change in how we conceive of ourselves. One of the terms I would just like to see retired and never used again is English Canada. I really don't think there are English Canadas. There's multiple ones. I often joke with my fiance is she's from Newfoundland. She's from St. John's, and I knew very little about it about Newfoundland until we started dating. And she insists. She's from St. John's. But her family have been in Newfoundland for centuries. They're old stock, as they like to say.
Right. As Harper got lambasted for.
Yeah, exactly. As he got in trouble for. But my fiance, she's Canadian, but she identifies as a Newfoundlander first, and she's quite determined about that. It's something she insists on, and I've been there quite a few times with her now. And the one thing I was fascinated by when I was going there is the flags. I've took kind of a nerdy interest in flags to begin with, so it's something I keep an eye on. But when I've been there, I've kept an eye on the flags you see. And the flag you see the least in Newfoundland is if you're excluding like provincial government buildings, the flag you see the least, I think, is probably the actual the new provincial flag they have, and then the maple leaf. The one you see all over the place is the Republic of Newfoundland flag, the one that's the Irish tricolor.
Right, right.
And like my fiance's parents have a bumper sticker with it on the back of their car, and it's just kind of it's a flag that just has a local tradition, right? It's not actually a symbol of anti-monarchy republicanism or anything like that. For the most part, it's just kind of a symbol of local identity.
It's just, this is our heritage.
Yeah, but what's interesting about Newfoundland itself used to be it's an island, and it's been historically an island with lots of basically mini islands of kind of these very isolated communities, right? So the idea of kind of a cohesive Newfoundland identity, as opposed to just like your village X and village Y identities, that itself is actually quite a new development. The idea there's any kind of unitary or like cohesive Newfoundland identity, but people are growing and people are adopting it, and it's powerful, right? And it defines who people are. It's their identity.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and that's the most interesting thing I think about patriotism, nationalism, is that it gives people a sense of belonging, which I would argue is lacking more and more in the modern world. But what do you see that sense of belonging as Canadians? How do we develop that more? What
Yeah,
direction do we need to
I think
take?
I wish the one thing I don't think people will sometimes say, well, there's no such thing as a Canadian. Define me. What does it mean to be Canadian? Define it, as if like an identity is just literally a bullet point list.
Yes, yes.
Identities are much more kind of organic and cohesive, or just natural than that. And I think the thing that makes me kind of optimistic long term about this is nothing in the last kind of 50 years that has changed, in the sense that Canadians retain as strong as desire as ever to be Canadian. And even if it would be silly, but also it's not even desirable to ask people to be like, okay, you're a Canadian, we need you to then pass this test and pass these 5 questions that proves you're a Canadian.
No.
A point list of things you have to check off. What makes me optimistic is that because these identities, like you say, because belonging is something that even if it's constructed, it's organic. It's not just something you can artificially impose. So those of us that want to build this kind of are looking at kind of how you long-term build this kind of new project, what a new Canada, what a future Canada looks like. The goal shouldn't just be to kind of like get 5 bullet points down that you can then poll people, and then people can say that's what it means to be Canadian. The goal should be a kind of those common loves and those common feelings and attachments. Continue to kind of figure out ways to find ways to not simply to nurture them, but to kind of orient them in a direction that prevent that. My biggest worry about the next 100 years of Canada, or so, my lifetime, is a kind of fragmentation, fracturing, where if we don't have this kind of cohesive purpose to stay together, but we have these strong local attachments, the point of why Canada, what's the point of it? It becomes harder and harder to answer that question. And my fear is a kind of fragmentation where kind of just becomes kind of balkanized into various different micronations, and I think that'd be a disaster. Be a disaster because, one, like I said, I think what we built here is something good, something remarkable that we should try and preserve. But also, I don't think I think the kind of the national pitch, or the national kind of intent has to be that these Canada is still a 38 million people or something like that. We sit next to a giant, right?
Yes.
That is
the mouse and the elephant in the bed.
Yeah,
Trudeau analogy. Yes,
exactly. This is never going to be something that, unless America balkanizes and fractures into 15 different nations or something, we're always going to be sitting, sharing a border with this ginormous, not just like political superpower, but with this cultural hegemon. And if we want to kind of preserve a kind of, there's a strength in unity, where those common loves and attachments that we have, or that those local and regional and distinct loves and attachments that we have, are stronger together, in the sense that by building this kind of strong, cohesive, attractive, prosperous nation, it allows us to all those various identities can grow, they can be nourished, and they can be ultimately be preserved because we have we as a nation together, we still have this kind of a capacity to resist it in some sense. Whereas that kind of, if we did in a hypothetical world where Canada did fragment and we, Canada became 6 different countries kind of thing, we would just inevitably get absorbed into kind of into America. We might be able to preserve kind of those identities for a while, but to resist the kind of hegemony, the kind of cultural and political power of America, it requires a kind of it requires what we should be, which is a kind of a confederation of regions. It requires a kind of a strength in numbers where the thing that glues us together as Canadians is that we're allowed to have. It becomes commonplace for Canadians to have dual identities, where you're an Albertan and a Canadian, and maybe you're an Albertan first and a Canadian second, but those two identities are understood to go hand in hand. So it's I've said sometimes that Canada needs to move away from kind of a liberal nationalism towards a more plural nationalism. And what I mean by that is that kind of the primacy, the thing that we need to kind of build our future on is these kind of thick loyalties and attachments, because they're not going away. They're not going to be suppressed, and they shouldn't be suppressed.
They should be added to.
Yeah, it should be. The question of I mean, I know that the people use the kind of the melting pot versus the mosaic as kind of the comparison, kind of how Canadian and American assimilation policies work. Canada still has a kind of that liberal nationalism. I don't think the mosaic is actually the best. I think we are a melting pot. It's just that in a sense that the melting pot, the question of a melting pot is always whose melting pot, right? Whose pot are you being melted into? What are you being,
right.
But what I think people that are kind of melted or kind of completely submerged in kind of liberal, they think like liberals, is they think that these kind of liberal principles are entirely neutral. They're not. There's basic kind of commitments, and I'm not saying it's not a reason to reject them necessarily. Liberal commitments are not neutral, right? They require you to think in certain ways that do thin and kind of homogenize certain attachments and thin them down. Which I think, if you're like me and you're committed to these kind of pluralistic identities and distinctive pluralistic identities, you don't want to build a kind of national culture that forces people to flatten them, forces them to say, well, I'm X, but in order to be Y, I have to think this, and it reduces those thick attachments to just basically preferences in the way that, like, you're choosing between McDonald's and Burger King kind of thing.
Yeah, it gives you the illusion of choice as opposed to the reality of it, because it's almost Borg-like, right? If we're going for a Star Trek reference, where you're being subsumed into a larger thing. I like that, the strong attachment things. You've been quite vocal in your, let's say, criticisms of certain elements of conservatism, in that they kind of poo-poo the Canadian identity and that it isn't a real thing. And I liked what you said earlier about how being not American is something we can have a foundation on. What would be maybe you could speak a little more detailed on what you see as kind of the problem with that conservative mentality of kind of exalting Americanism and denigrating Canadian identity.
Well, I think there's two ways, there's kind of two sides you can approach it from. The first is that I think I don't think it's entirely the thing that I think that kind of brand of conservatism is rejecting is it's rejecting it rejects Canada in the sense that it rejects that new liberal nationalism that's been constructed in the second half of the 20th century. That liberal nationalism was still constructed in some sense. There was still an attempt to kind of preserve a Canadian identity in the making of that, and as part of that, it was about preserving a kind of why we're not American. What I think has happened is it's flipped, in the sense that now the thing that makes us not American is that we're more liberal, not less liberal, and which is historically not how it was.
No.
Grant an influence here, but like historically, it was kind of our restraint, not our kind of progressivism, that made us different from those wild Americans.
We were slower to make changes. We pay. One of the things I love about the founding of Canada is how we saw how the state system had problems, so we became a confederation, right? We saw how the unitary state caused problems in the UK. So we're like, well, we want provinces, but we don't want them to have the same powers as states.
And well, and interestingly, I mean, I complain all the time that Canadians don't know the history of their founders and their founding, and the way, especially in the way that Americans do. And there is, it is a problem. It is a serious problem. But I do think there's one of the things that actually, paradoxically, that's good about our founding is that our founding was our founding debates and our actual founding itself, in 1867, was a very practical. It was a practical confederation. It wasn't. You can go and read the debates. They're not that widely. And there's actually kind of collections that are just in the process of being made right now that will make this stuff more accessible. So there is not that there isn't a kind of philosophical and like real distinct kind of substance to the kind of debates around confederation. But what they were is the confederation was ultimately a practical exercise in figuring out how we could build this union that could work together and survive. Now that sounds it's the paradox of Canadian history that its success is in some sense that people find that boring because it's not, the American founding, it is kind of exhilarating in the sense that you have these larger than life, almost like civic demigods in the various founding fathers that were all kind of quite, like Madison was a like undeniably like sharp mind.
Yes. Oh, well, I mean, Jefferson as well, I would say.
Yeah, but all of them, Hamilton, all of these people, they're fascinating people and they're deep, highly philosophical people. So that makes the American founding much more kind of a philosophical founding, and it was a philosophical founding, right? It was a liberal founding. Our founding was not a kind of purely an exercise in kind of speculative philosophy. It was a very practical activity, but that itself is part of what makes us good and what makes us distinct. Is we're not kind of we're not bound up in kind of hyper speculation. We're actually a very grounded, a very practical, and I'd say a very Burkean kind of founding in the sense that it's not grounded just in kind of pure abstract loyalties and attachments. It's grounded in kind of these groups that came together to figure out how to make it work, and they found this, and they came up with this remarkable compromise. Now that is the kind of the story we should tell ourselves about our foundings. And the thing that we should celebrate is the thing that might make it less kind of attractive to kind of young minds, where it's not this kind of we don't have there's no Publius, right? There was no kind of there are founding debates, but there's no Federalist Papers or anything like that, or the Anti-Federalist Papers, stuff like that. But that itself is part of why we should celebrate it. The practicality and the Burkean kind of realism of our founding is precisely why we built this remarkably successful country. So the story we have to tell ourselves has to include something like that.
And despite our great national debates, you brought up kind of the existential regionalization of balkanization, and I guess other past guests have talked a lot about kind of the existential crisis that was the referendum in Quebec. I think we sometimes make these things bigger than they are in order to create some kind of crisis narrative in our country. But the truth is we are kind of the steady as she goes incrementalism. That is a big part of our story. And I think we're coming into a time, arguably philosophically, where people are beginning to talk more about process than outcome. They're talking about enjoying the process, not just having goals, but loving what you do in the process of getting to those goals. And I think as Canadians, we need to really embrace that if we can love the process of being those people, being the incrementalists, being the people who just try to make things a little bit better, not letting the perfect become the enemy of the good, we'll quickly realize that that's actually how you build a successful society, and arguably how we have up to this point.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think we need a kind of, and it would be disastrous if we ever did have this. We don't need a kind of a new founding or anything like that. We don't need to get all the silly academics and wonks in the room together to build this new constitution that'll be perfect. That'd be a terrible idea. What we need is a kind of slow, like I said, I do think Canada is going to have to change in order to survive. And part of that is going to have to just involve the changing realities of, like I said, the shift of gravity westward and these emerging local identities. But the way that I don't think we need to the way to kind of adapt and accommodate that isn't to build a kind of, to write a manifesto for the new Canada or anything like that. The way to do it is going to be in a distinctly Canadian way, is going to, like you say, very incrementally. These broader problems should always be at the back of our minds, especially for those of us that are kind of involved in public life or anything like that. We should be thinking about these things. We should have them at the back of our minds. We shouldn't be kind of just thinking about them in kind of like ideological and abstract terms. But when we're making decisions and thinking about how things need to change, how things need to go, these are the kind of questions that should kind of that should animate the decisions we make. But the decisions we make are ultimately going to have to be, they should be practical and they should be incremental. So that the new Canada we're building is not going to emerge from a second founding or anything like that. It's going to emerge slowly through hard work and through cooperation, also just through kind of the kind of prudence and the wisdom that I actually think, like I said, is part of our. It's in the part of the Canadian way of doing things, is that kind of prudential restraint and wisdom, and part of what we need to do, especially on the right, to kind of because one thing I do think I'm pretty vocal about kind of the way I think conservatism here needs to change. Part of what I think a kind of future-oriented conservatism in Canada has to look like is it has to actively recover that kind of prudential approach to kind of statecraft and governing, which is, it partially is because it's how it's conservative, it's how conservatives should think, but also because it's part of our heritage, it is who we are. So in the way that a Canadian conservative can be truly a distinctly Canadian conservative and can actually contribute in real substantive ways to public life here and to governance here, is by bringing this approach, bringing this kind of Canadian way of doing things to bear on public questions, and rejecting the kind of there's a big difference between kind of prudence and the kind of technocratic liberalism that we're governed by mostly today, that even conservatives fall prey to all the time. There's a different kind of mindset that needs to be cultivated there. But it's not, like I say, it's not some sort of, we don't need a second founding, we don't need a new constitution, we don't need kind of radical, what we need to do is we need to kind of, over the next century, these should be the kind of animating things we're building bit by bit by bit.
And I think like people talk about draping, the conservatives need to drape themselves in the Canadian flag. But I think when people hear that from outside of maybe the circles that you and I travel in, they hear that as kind of an American sort of patriotism. I think a Canadian patriotism, like you just pointed out, needs to be a patriotism of common sense, of a commitment
Yeah,
to, like you said, prudence, uh, actually elevating our values. I think of Rome, right? The values that Rome had, they're very different perhaps than the values that Canada has, but they believed in their values, and they constantly talked about their values, and those values became entrenched in their civil society. We
yeah,
should be entrenching Canadian values. And I mean, that's a big part of what we're trying to do here. And I think it's a big part of what you're trying to do from me following your work, is we need to start reframing our understanding of ourselves. We don't need to make a new self. We just need to have a different perspective on that self.
yeah, exactly. And we do, there is a sorry for hearing my dog in the background. There's going to be a there's going to be a need to kind of push back against the kind of the way that, I mean, the difference between I'm going to spawn down, or it's a kind of a more academic paper on this, but the difference between Trudeau Senior and Trudeau Junior is that I actually, as much as people love to, I'm not saying Justin Trudeau is a genius or like a deep mind or anything like that, but I don't think he's nearly as vacuous as people think he is sometimes. And like I say, when he said Canada is he said it back just after he was elected in 2015. I think it was just after he was elected. And this idea that we're the first post-national, we could be the first post-national state. That is the kind of the end of the liberal nationalism of his father and of Pearson.
Yes. Yes.
Well, he's been kind of saturated in this stuff his whole life. So I think he knows. Even if it's conscious or not, he's imbibed it, and he's kind of following it to its logical conclusion. Well, down that road of post-national country is not it's not a national future. There's nothing.
No,
There is
no, exactly.
and I think that, but that is the in the way that the Liberal Party itself has, I mean, I'm not, it's going to sound like a partisan point. It's not really. The way that the Liberal Party kind of monopolized, one of the most interesting things about kind of Canadian party dynamics is that the kind of the National Party, the party of the flag, became the Liberal Party, right? Became the center left or centrist party, whatever you want to call them. Whereas in most countries, it's the opposite, right? It's usually the conservative parties that kind of are able to kind of be the party of the flag.
I think the Liberal Party as a organization is one of the most successful political movements in the Western world.
Part of that success is totally that it became the party of Canada. Right?
Yes, yeah. So you marry sense of protection that left-wing governments can kind of give to the population with patriotism. It's a very potent strategy.
Exactly, and it's a very it's been a successful one. But if the kind of the reason the reason the Liberal Party could do that is because our nationalism became a liberal nationalism.
And that's the thing that needs to be taken back by the Conservatives.
And but if the kind of the development of this liberal nationalism, if it's got to the end of the road and it's got to this post-national nationalism, this post-national nationalism, such a thing exists, but if that's the kind of the place where they're at, then it's a great opportunity for someone else, whether it's to become the party of national, to become the party of the flag again, because the party of Canada cannot be the party of Canada isn't a real country.
I love that. Well, it's particularly, I don't know if you saw this tweet, I forget who tweeted it, but someone actually said, imagine thinking Canada should be a country. I don't know if you saw that tweet, but
I recall. Yeah, well, that's the kind of stuff that gets a mute from me on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't want to take too much more of your time, and we usually try to keep this to 45 minutes. So what I usually ask guests at the end is, can you just summarize the three questions? The first, why do you love Canada? The second, what do you think Canada could be, and what do you think Canada should be? Into like 2 sentences for each of those.
Well, why I love Canada would be because we built this remarkable society that deserves this remarkably inclusive and diverse society that can accommodate the various. We built this remarkably peaceful and prosperous nation, a beautiful, peaceful and prosperous nation that honestly should be. The rest of the world should be jealous of. So that's the first just reason why I can't come to love Canada. Repeat the.
The second one is like project us into the future. What is like, let's blue sky this. What could Canada be, and then if you want to go into like more moral philosophy, I had one guest say they see Canada as kind of the heart of the world, like showing the world the way of how we can live in harmony with one another. What would be your like what's your could Canada be and what's your should Canada be?
Canada could be a kind of a nation of nations, a true nation of nations, a kind of a true confederation, actually, if you will, we're already a relatively decentralized country, but we could become a truly kind of continental confederation that enables the kind of the prosperity and the flourishing of these various different communities that understand themselves as being linked together, even if they can, while at the same time preserving their distinctiveness. And that would be a kind of that's what we could be, and that is also what we should be. Because if that is what we can become, and that is what we should become, that should become something that could be a model. We're already a model for the world, but that would be something truly special.
Arguably that would be kind of a shining light on the hill, saying this is how you can live in harmony with one another, humanity, the thing you've been unable to do for your entire history.
Yeah, and I think Canadians are one of if I was going to criticize a kind of Canadianism, Canadians are far too modest and far too humble at times. That modesty can sometimes become smugness in a kind of strange way. But one of the things we need to do, and this is what I mean by becoming championing this kind of a new nationalism, we shouldn't just aspire for kind of niceness. We should aspire for genuine greatness.
Yes.
I would say become a proverbial city on a hill, and becoming what I'm suggesting is becoming that kind of continental confederation, a truly continental confederation. That would be something that would make it. That would be it could be a model for genuine greatness. We're already great. We could be greater. And that is the kind of model for greatness that we should be aspiring for.
I love that. And thank you very much for joining. I'm sure I'm going to be inviting you back on. Thank you for all you're doing, as someone who's come here and come to love our country, for all you're doing for the intellectual kind of sphere of Canada. I very much, I know I appreciate it. And I know a lot of my friends and colleagues do as well. So
That's good to hear. I'm glad to hear that.
you're very much appreciated. I'll say that. And with that, I'll let you go. And thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.